Over the summer, we recorded a presentation given by Squadron leader Tony Iveson DFC, who flew as a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain and later with Bomber Command joining the famous 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. More information on the two talks can be found on our website, thehistorynetwork.org. This is an excerpt from the question and answers session at the end of the talks.
I joined the reserve before the war. I learned to fly. My first solo was in January 1939. I'd done about 70 hours at weekends in summer camp, so I was in it from the very start. So I went into fighter command in 1940. They made me an instructor in 1941, and I had 2 years teaching people to fly in this country and in Rhodesia. And when I came back, I was sent to bomber command. I had a bit of a discussion with my station commander saying I'd flown fighters, I'd been instructing on a certain aircraft called the Harvard, which was a single-engine trainer for fighters out in Africa. And why wasn't I going back to fighters? And he was a sensible bloke, thinking back. He was a pilot of the First War, Group Captain James, who had a military cross. And he said, "Sit down, young man, take your hat off," because that's what you do in two officers, you get on a level. "Tell me what's bugging you." And he went on to tell me, well, there's only one command which is taking the war to the enemy, and that's Bomber Command. And we need good pilots, and you've got a number of average assessment. We need people like you. I was convinced. I didn't have much choice, Mark. Well, an ordinary day for a fighter pilot, if we go back to, say, September 1940, would be getting up at about 5 o'clock in the morning, because I was at Biggin Hill after Biggin Hill had been badly bombed, so we lived out in some kind of luxury on Westram Hill in the upper floor of a house there. So we'd be coming down and meeting our landlady who had prepared a bit of breakfast for us. Not that one had much appetite, at least I didn't have. And the transport would arrive, and we'd drive up the hill and then to the airfield. And we'd go out to dispersal, look at our aeroplane, go out and see the parachute was in the seat, and that the fitter had run the engine, so the temperatures were okay, and the aircraft was perfect. Then we would sign for it on what was called the Form 700. Each aeroplane had its own history, and we had to. And then it was my responsibility as the pilot. I'd checked that anything that needed to be done had been done, and all the corporal and the sergeant would all have signed it as well. So as far as my aeroplane was ready, sitting against the chocks with the battery plugged in. And then we would, the waiting time began. And one would sit, if it was a nice morning, in the deck chair, otherwise in the crew room. Some people would try to sleep, others might play cards, others might just chat, others might just sit and stare. And the telephone would ring. And immediately, and perhaps, it said, "Neffy up," or something like that. And then, of course, it had another ring which one felt one could readily discern. And the corporal would open and say, "Scramble!" And everybody dashed to their aircraft, leapt in. The fitter would help you do your parachute straps up, then the Sutton harness. And then we would pull up the door and slam the, and by that time I'd press the button and the engine would be running. Chocks away, and away we went. In Bomber Command, it was a bit different. I was with 617 Squadron, and tomorrow I'll be talking about 3 raids we did on the great German battleship Tirpitz, which was sitting way up in the Arctic Ocean, and when we sank it in November '44. But with that squadron, I lived in great comfort in a hotel called the Petwood Hotel in Woodall Spa, halfway between Lincoln and Boston. It is now a magnificent hotel, and I was there only a few weeks ago for a reunion. But that's where we lived, to the envy of everybody else in the group who lived in old nuts. Well, there, I was a flight commander on the squadron. It might be my responsibility, say, on this particular day to do a flight test, an air test. which I do is check the weather and everything. But normally we would assemble at flights at about 9 o'clock. There'd be certain, for some of the air crew, there would be, you know, the gunnery leader might want the gunners together, or the navigation or whatever. This was if we had no operation schedule. And then perhaps we would go up and do some bombing, high-level bombing practice, because that was our job at that time. We had one bomb weighing 5 tons called a tall boy, which we normally dropped on ops from about 15,000 feet. So we did a lot of high-level bombing practice near Skegness. Sometimes there might be some cross countries, other times it might just be a test of an aircraft if it had something, some fault. And in the afternoon we might go and play football or something. But then either early in the morning or in the evening, the battle order would go up on the notice board by the hotel reception. And in 617 Squadron, if there was an operation, everybody there flew. On the main force, it was different. They couldn't allow the commanding officer and flight commanders to fly on every trip, because you know, if you kept on losing them, they were very valuable people, so they had just the odd, every other trip maybe. But in my squadron, we all went, so there we were on the battle orders, so we knew what time we'd be flying out, what time we'd be getting up, when the briefing would be, when the flight meal would be. And that was a bomber squadron day. I think perhaps we'd only heard of the word stress in relation to stress kin on an aeroplane or something. I'm not sure it had been invented. Because when all this came out, I remember talking to some of my buddies and said, well, what would we have done if after one flight a pretty girl with a clipboard had come along and said, well, how did it go? And did you enjoy it? And have you any comments? We might have said, well, okay, we've been there. All I want is the T-shirt, and thank you very much. You can carry it. We were living in a war atmosphere, and had been for, in my case, for 5 years. And it's very hard to, you know, to convey what it was like. 5 years of war. And one thing one finds out, you can't be scared stiff all the time, any more than you can be rapturously happy all the time. In the end, your body says, well, either you pack it in or you live with it. And living on a squadron like 617 Squadron, I've never known a bunch of people in my life since. They were from all over the world, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Americans, and from all over the British Isles. And they were a magnificent team. We were a family, really, not just a squadron. And going to the squadron a year after the dams, as the first pilot to go there who hadn't previously done a bomber tour, I was very conscious of the squadron's reputation and how necessary it was that, you know, one tried to live up to it. And I think that all of us felt that way. So that as I didn't think about stress. I mean, I know one particular airman who said he couldn't go on, but he had a DFM and had done about 40 trips. So, you know, my commanding officer just posted him. There was no nonsense about, you know, court-martials or anything. It was just, you know, our generation, we inherited this war, this situation, and like any serviceman, we just got on with it. No one did ask if we enjoyed it. When I was taken off operations in February 1945, I was sent to a station near Nottingham to train as an airline pilot, because the aircraft they were going to use to reopen this route from London to Sydney was a converted Lancaster called the Lancastrian, an airliner called the Lancastrian. And I was a Lancaster pilot, and I had several hundred hours on the thing. So along with others, I was sent and learned to be, and I got what was then called a B license. It's now the Airline Transport Pilot's license. And I was seconded to BOAC at a airfield called Herne near Bournemouth. And you may not know, but the first scheduled service left Heathrow Airport before VE Day. The Lancastrian was chosen because it was the only aeroplane that would fly the long distances. We flew from, first of all, from Herne before Heathrow opened to Lydda, which is an airfield behind Tel Aviv in what is now Israel. We changed crews there. The aircraft went on to Karachi in Pakistan, then down to Colombo in Sri Lanka, and then a very long flight to Darwin in North Australia before Singapore was recaptured, and that was 16 hours, and then on to Sydney. And you could have bought a ticket in 1945, I don't know how much for, but in about 80 hours elapsed time, if all went well, you'd be in Sydney. It doesn't take quite so long now. And we had all of 9 passengers. And anyone who took that long flight would have emerged from the because all they'd put round inside the Lancaster was a beaver board. And everyone sat in line like this. They didn't sit in seats behind each other. There wasn't enough room for that. And then you had 4 Merlins belting away. On one occasion, I picked up passengers in Palestine to fly to India, and 2 of them were rather, to me, 25 years old, and elderly people. They were the general and his wife of the Salvation Army, General Carpenter. And his wife was a relative of Mr. Booth, who founded the Salvation Army. And I was very concerned. We were doing a night flight, and I knew across the desert and down the Persian Gulf, it could be a bit rough. We were limited to 12,000 feet. We weren't pressurized, and we would, unless in emergency, we could go high, but then we had to pull down or let down the normal rubber aircrew oxygen mask. And at 12,000 feet, I can tell you that's where the weather is. Bump, bump, bump. And I was very concerned because she looked a very frail old lady. And so I said, if you have any problems, do send for me. The steward will look after you. And I went back a couple of times. And we landed successfully and without much trouble in Pakistan. And about 2 weeks later, I received a copy of a book she'd written about her relative who'd founded the Salvation Army with a very nice letter thanking me for my care as a passenger. And there won't be many airline captains who have that letter today, I can tell you. And after that, I was still in the Air Force. After that, I was offered a contract with BAC, went back to the RAF to Transport Command, had a long talk with my father when I was offered a permanent commission, and decided after that the flying wasn't going to be the same, and I left the Air Force in 1951. And looking back, I think I had the best of it, in a way. Yeah. Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being such an attentive audience. I hope you found it interesting.